Ryan Stain here with ACEP Frontline, and today we're here at Leadership and Advocacy Conference in Washington, D.C. Just a great time of year every single time. And here today with Nathan Gonzalez with Inside Elections. He gives us an update. I know you've done it a few times for us here, and I always love it because the amount of dedication we have as emergency physicians, you have that same dedication to breaking down politics, but without taking a side. And so first give us a little background on yourself and inside politics.
Yeah, and it's probably in the 80s movies, 90s movies jokes or something probably helped too. So I've been doing nonpartisan election analysis for almost 25 years now. It started when I was 8 years old. Not that young, but I've always been on the journalism and media track. I didn't catch the political bug until senior year of college and realize this is what I wanted to write about. And so now really have an opportunity to identify what are the most important races in the country, look at the candidates, look at how they line up with the voters or constituents, try to figure out who's going to win, which party is going to be in the majority, and what that might look like for Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill, and what that looks like for the country. And so I'm in this rare where I've been doing largely the same thing for a long time. But I feel fortunate to get to do it.
Well, it is interesting that you caught the bug. I can see why you caught it late, because you said Oregon, correct?
Oregon. I grew up in Oregon. Yeah.
And so coming from Oregon, probably about as far disconnected that isn't an island or just an offshoot of the United States as part of the United States. But diving into it now, with seeing everything that's going on, kind of give us these trends and things that you see, because now, of course, we had the most monumental election of the moment,
Correct.
Which is every one of them now.
Correct.
And because you're trying to get headlines, trying to get clicks. Talk about kind of what has just happened, what we've just seen, and kind of how that plays into the patterns we've seen over the last number of election cycles.
Yep. So in 2024, Republicans had a great year. I mean, Republicans won the White House, they won the Senate majority, and they held the House. And Republicans, you hear a lot of talk from President Trump and Republicans about a mandate because they see that trifecta that they won. President Trump won the popular vote in the presidential election for the first time in 20 years. And so that is part of what is leading Republicans to be so aggressive on this policy front. Now, I think that they are probably being more aggressive than what voters actually wanted. I don't think voters voted for Republicans because they were in love with Republicans. They voted because they were dissatisfied with what Democrats were doing. Democrats, President Biden and Vice President Harris, had the White House. Voters were dissatisfied with the direction of the country and the economy, so voters made a change. They made a change toward those Republicans. But Republicans are testing how much voters really wanted all of those policies that they talked about in the midterm elections, are that accountability, that if voters feel like Republicans have gone too far, then they're going to vote against Republicans, they're going to vote for more Democrats to have some sort of check and balance. And that's what we see when you talked about cycles.
Mm-hmm.
In my time of doing this, we've declared the end of both political parties, the death of both political parties. I remember in 2004, Democrats lost to President Bush. And like, how could Democrats lose? Bush is dumb as a box of rocks. How could this happen? Democrats will never be in power again. And what happened? 2 years later, Democrats come roaring into the majority in the House and win the Senate. 2 years after that, Obama's elected president, and we're talking about Republicans. They're never going to be in power again. It's the Obama coalition. And what happened? 2 years after that, Republicans win 63 seats in the House. They win. So we go in these cycles and you say, well, why is that? It's because usually the winning party learns the wrong lessons from the election. They think it's because voters are in love with their policies and they go too far. And then there's a reaction from voters who say, no, we need some balance. And so that's where Republicans are right now. I think they're trying to embrace the power that they have, but they are risking going too far and not having that power for very long.
And you mentioned even there the narrow margins. There's a difference. To me, a mandate, a wave, or whatever, a blue wave, a red wave, whatever it is, whatever color the ocean is at the moment, it's very different, based on what we're seeing, which is the margins are actually very narrow, relatively. When you're talking about, landslides being the difference between, a 49 versus a 48 for the 47 or 52, 53, whatever it may be. It's still a very small margin that's there. And you mentioned coming up with the theoretically off cycle, which you don't necessarily like to say is the off cycle.
Off years aren't good for business.
Yes.
But they're important.
But you mentioned that is the constituency of the president the same constituency that will show up if he's not on the ballot.
Right.
Now, kind of roll into that because we have a lot of significant elections. We have a lot of retirements. We have a lot, both parties, people transitioning points. My congressman just announced a run for McConnell's seat for Senate.
Yep.
So that's going to be open. That's going to be changing up. It's in a relatively considered purple district. Talk about kind of how this interestingly kind of play out that we may see here coming up in 26 that didn't take place in 24.
Right now, Republicans believe that President Trump has reformed the two parties, that he has restructured our party system, and that Republicans are now the blue-collar, working-class, growing, diverse party. And that is partially describes the coalition that elected Trump, but it's not a guarantee that that coalition is going to come out to vote and elect Republicans when he isn't on the ballot, because I think a lot of it is the Republican Party is Trump first voters who like him because he's a businessman, he's an outsider, he's a deal maker, he's not part of the establishment, and all of these things. And so 2026 is going to be a test of whether Republicans can turn out Trump voters when he's not on the ballot, and it's not a guarantee. And this is not unique to Republicans either. We talked about President Obama. Democrats struggled with this too, that Obama had his coalition that got him elected, got him reelected, but when he wasn't on the ballot, Democrats struggled to turn out all of those voters. So that is one of the core pieces, and we're at a point where every Senate seat matters, every House seat matters, because those majorities are so close. And it's neither party can take even solid states for granted, because in Kentucky, for example, Kentucky's elected a Democratic governor for all except for one term for the last 3 or 4 decades, I believe. And so there are circumstances when red states will vote for Democrats or blue states will vote for Republicans. Usually they're in state elections, not federal elections. But if the political conditions turn against Republicans in such a way that voters are really upset about what's going on, then you start to see things that would politically normally would happen now, or start to happen because it's not a normal situation.
And we're seeing a lot of shifts. I mean, you talked about Virginia. Kentucky's a good example. I mean, the House was blue for basically a century. It finally it went red and then went super red. And now we see, since I've lived in Kentucky, it was typically federally pretty conservative, state-based, pretty progressive in terms on the blue side. Now shifting much more, with the exception of Lexington, Louisville, some of the city centers where we are. But we are seeing a lot of changes in shifts across the country. And so you mentioned coming up, significant changes, elections, the governor for Virginia coming up, and how some of that may impact these things. Kind of focus on some of those things where we're seeing a little bit of the shuffling of the cards that may impact it, and how some of these areas that are assumed to be certain shades on the palette may be shifting a little bit.
Yeah. Even for those people who are listening and watching that aren't from New Jersey or Virginia, you're going to hear a lot about New Jersey and Virginia this fall, because they have races for governor, and they're going to get attention because it's almost the two biggest games in town in a year when there aren't other things going on. But it's going to be a test of that Trump coalition versus Republican coalition. Trump, surprisingly, finished closer than expected in New Jersey. Right? It was just 4 or 5 points. And so can whomever Republicans nominate, the primary is in June, can that person, what does that margin look like compared to Trump's margin? Or in Virginia is a Democratic state, but you also have a large number of federal workers who have been impacted specifically by President Trump and Elon Musk and their initial policies, or Doge, and those things. So it's a microcosm a little bit of the issue, the policies, stuff that we're seeing, or the executive actions that we're seeing implemented in Virginia. And if the front runner on the Democratic side is Abigail Spanberger, who's a former congresswoman, also with a CIA background. If she's able to win, I think she starts to get into that conversation about 2028 and who are Democrats going to look at to try to carry the party mantle into the presidential election.
And you actually mentioned that a little bit, because right now, I mean, you talked about Clinton, Obama, whether it was Bush, now with Trump. The parties have an identity when somebody in that party is in the White House. But when there's a loss, such as what we saw this past year with Harris, there tends to be kind of the ship floating at sea, a little bit rudderless,
Yeah.
or maybe several rudders kind of go in different directions. You mentioned that we may not see the Democrat Party end up with a direction for a while until we get closer to 28.
Yep. This is normal for the party that doesn't hold the White House. But anytime the party is in it, it feels a little bit unstable. But you have all pieces of the Democratic Party kind of standing up and saying, all right, we need someone who is more moderate. Or you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doing rallies in Idaho with Bernie Sanders, saying this is the direction that the party needs to go. Or there's the policy fight, but there's also the stylistic fight. Mm-hmm. Does it need to be more aggressive or alpha male, almost coarse language? Is that to try to match Trump? Democrats are searching, and that's. But one of the key points, though, is that I'm not even sure the Democratic primary voters, who are ultimately going to make the decision on who that nominee is, I don't think they know who they want or what type of person they want to lead the party. There's going to be politicians. Governor Gavin Newsom is maybe former Secretary Pete Buttigieg, former Mayor Pete Buttigieg, or Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. But there's going to be a lane for an outsider, a Democratic outsider. I'm not sure that it's Stephen A. Smith of ESPN, but along that lane, because I think Democrats have seen the success that Republicans have of getting behind someone who is not neatly tied to politics, government, politicians. So who that is, I don't know. People can comment or give their feedback, but there's going to be an outsider lane along with these other more established politicians who are going to run.
And for us as emergency medicine, it's important to have relationships. We represent physicians with all different belief systems. There's not one color or one side of the aisle has all the answers for emergency medicine and healthcare. Kind of dive in a little bit of how that interaction, that play of understanding the reality of politics versus the duality that we see often with Republican and Democrat versus the realities of how things work with such close margins across the country and within Washington.
Well, diversifying your political relationships and influence is important because one party is not going to be in control forever. I mean, there is going to be this. We feel like there's perpetual change and constant change in who's in power. So you need to be at the table no matter which party is in power. And that's not just in Washington. I think it's good to play the long game with relationships, that your state legislators or your mayors, your city council members, that is the farm team for Congress. Those are future lawmakers, and so they're not any less significant if you have a relationship with your state senator or your state rep. In policies, there are policies that are being impacted at the state level that affect doctors, but also some of those people are going to eventually be in Washington and on Capitol Hill, and that's important. And I would say also, I keep saying everything is a key piece because it's all important. But if you have a member or members that you need to compromise to get legislation done, I think people need to realize that they are often taking a political risk by doing that. The voters say, just get together, get something done. But electorally, what I see is that the members who do compromise are all usually faced with opposition in a primary, right, who are punished by some voters or candidates who say, no, we don't need someone who's going to work with those MAGA people or who's going to work with those communists. We need someone who's going to be a real liberal or a real conservative or whatnot. And so if you need compromise, and some of the most important pieces you have to have compromise, realize that members taking political risk, and they want to know who's with them, who has their support, whether it's individually, doctors individually, or collectively through the PAC, whatever it might be, that they have support because they're taking a risk.
All right, so we'll wrap up today because you took questions right at the end, and one of the questions was one that, be doing TV and radio, it's close to my heart. When they say TV, they're like, well, why don't you tell stories of good news? And the same thing with politics is they're saying, well, how do we find a truly nonpartisan, other than inside politics, as you mentioned? What why we don't tend to see the proliferation of theoretically unbiased media.
What we have to realize is that most media companies are businesses. Most of them are businesses trying to make money, and they are often going to, I think they are sincere in their dedication to having nonpartisan or unbiased news, but they are probably going to make decisions on coverage to things that are more provocative, or headlines that are more provocative, or give voices, interview people who are interesting and newsy, not just the boring nonpartisan people who are in the middle, because that doesn't, people might say that they want that, but that's not what the channels that they're watching or the stories that they're clicking on or what. And so the creators of media I think we can do a lot to improve.
Mm-hmm.
But the consumers of media have to realize that they're in this game together, that whatever you are clicking on, subscribing to, watching, like, you are voting for a certain type of news coverage. And so if you want the straight ahead, kind of in the weeds, dirty policy stuff, that if you want that, then click on it, read it, share it, go for it. But also you have to realize, if you're clicking on the most provocative stuff, that
you won't believe what happens next.
It's a cycle. Yeah,
the clicks.
It's a cycle. So we don't have to. Maybe we can equally blame the creators and the consumers for the cycle that we're in. But and to the extent that everyone can in your normal daily life, to diversify your media intake, I think it is healthy. Understand? All right, I'm usually in this bubble, but can I at least take a peek at something else? It might not change your mind, but it might take the edge off of what you think about the people that are living in that world, on that side of the spectrum, consuming that media. You touched it, because if you're only watching one cable channel, you're not just getting one side of an issue. You're getting one set of issues that you may not even be aware of a whole other set of issues, because that channel's not even covering it. This channel over here, if you're watching that, you might not even know what's going on in the country or the world, because that channel's not even covering it. We have a chasm in, I think, our kind of the big media outlets right now. So,
and I feel like we're getting that way with a lot of even social media. It's where folks are not only picking platforms based on kind of the belief spectrum, but also then gravitating almost like your friends list to people with similar type belief systems, and assuming that the majority thinks like you do, which some things maybe, some things not. And so kind of getting that diversity of opinion, thought, and inclusion is important. And I completely agree, because like with news, they say, why don't you tell great stories, good stories, positive stories? Well, because people don't tune in. People have tried it, and you go out of business. At some point they have to pay the bills, and especially now in media with such a narrow margins that are there, everybody's struggling to get market share with regard to media.
This is not a paid commercial for Google, but I'll read some things on social media. A friend that will post it, and it's not something that I have in my regular intake, and so I'm like, oh, that does sound interesting, and I'll Google it, and there's usually some pretty readily available information that doesn't necessarily refute that, but it's more context. Like, okay,
there's a lot more to it.
It's not as simple as what this was making it out to be, but just take one extra step before sharing it with everybody else, or assuming that that's the gospel truth.
And interesting you said that, because this morning when I was on my flight up here, actually looked up a story that a couple of people on the feed had shared, and it's like, that doesn't even sound like it could be even accurate, considering that the same administration, in the last run had actually promoted this program. And sure enough, it was something that was a small nugget of a small piece that was then conflated to put a bubble on the whole thing, to say you're about to lose this. It turns a little issue or change into the sky is falling. And so I think that's really important, to get that balance, to get those different viewpoints, to understand. Don't just knee-jerk react, share, whatever. Just understand that there's probably a little bit more to the story than is actually there. And as you mentioned, you showed the slide. Almost every single election, something changes hands.
Right. 11 out of the last 13 elections, at least one of the White House, House, or Senate has changed party hands. People are not satisfied. They're looking for
And you think
change.
coming up in 26, if there's one that's likely going to do it, of course, White House can't, but at that point, you think it's the House.
The House is the Democrats have more opportunity for the House. The Senate map, things would really have to spiral out of control for Republicans or backlash against Republicans to pull the Senate, because Democrats they're going to need to win a couple of pretty solidly Republican states. But there's no reason to rule things out a year and a half before the election. But the House is much closer.
A lot of opportunities for gains and losses coming up over the next little bit. So Nathan Gonzalez, tell us about how folks can get your information, keep up with what you do.
Sure. You can go. We're at InsideElections.com. I'm still on Twitter /X at Nathan L. Gonzalez. My colleague is Jacob Rubashkin. He is super smart. He knows a lot of these races better than I do. So yeah, feel free to check us out.
Yeah, and it's been fantastic information. Every time I've seen you here at the conference, it's been great information. And yes, he does in fact keep it pretty right up the middle, so that is very appreciative.
No one punched me after the session.
You tell great jokes that kind of lean on one and lean on the other, but everybody gets a little bit of lean. But in the end, I agree. Nobody got too fired up. As for me, you can contact me, rstanton@acep.org, rstanton@acep.org, at EverydayMed on X. Till next time, I'm Dr. Ryan Stanton. This has been some ACEP Frontline.